Hey Jeff, thanks for joining me.
Hey Steve, thanks for having me again.
To have you. We are talking about right now a recipe for a housing crash and going back a little bit in time in terms of what happened with the '08 um, crash, the Great Recession, some of the causes. We got some data we pulled up from Wharton, and that really kind of sets the stage that we really had preceding '08 a lot of money supply being created, falling interest rates. And into that environment, Wall Street firms created a lot of product, including so-called ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets, subprime products, but ended up driving about $3 trillion into mortgages that had not existed before. And of course, we kind of know how that story ended with a pretty massive crash in real estate, especially particularly residential. But some of your thoughts as we look back in terms of what made for a housing crash, looking back at the Great Recession.
Look, I think I actually didn't even know that they were called ninja loans. I just called them, stated income loans because that's what I've known them forever to be. But I think, the reality of that was there were a lot of loans that were done that were sold as prime mortgages that weren't prime mortgages to people on stated income, and I used to use because it was a story that I knew of somebody who, um, was close to somebody that drove a taxi cab, said they made $1 million, bought a $2 or $3 million home trying to flip it in, that 30, 60, 90-day period, and then found themselves in a pinch when they couldn't sell it because the market crashed. I think the reality of people looking at today's market and assuming that it's somewhat similar, they look, nobody has a crystal ball. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some sort of black swan event that causes real estate to have this negative downward trend. But I don't see the quote unquote crash like 2008, right? Dodd Frank was put into place to kind of offset these problems that you had in the '08 crisis. You can't come in, you couldn't come in and do just a stated income loan. You actually had to prove you made money. You actually had to prove that you had the down payment assets to purchase a property. You couldn't just buy it and say, cool, I'm here, I'm going to sell it. So, I'm not saying that we couldn't have an issue. I just don't see things the same way as 2008.
Yeah, and I agree. And one of the things that actually, in my opinion, one of the causes was you had all this liquidity in the system. Wall Street wanted to find a way to make money off of all the available money. So, let's start with the real cause of the problem was the federal government and putting too much money, having rates too low. It's kind of like having an open bar with a bunch of alcoholics, Wall Street being the alcoholics. They're going to keep drinking as long as you're serving. Um, but what Wall Street did was when they're looking, how can we make money at this? They pulled up their models, economic models, and what they found is there had never been a national real estate crash, that the markets moved independently. So the idea was that we can create products that will put all these different diverse loans from different areas together, and that way we won't have any risk of it all going bad because we've never had a nationwide crash. You can have some, so but of course they created those very conditions by not having lending standards, by whether it was people who shouldn't have been able to buy a house being approved to have a house, or people who shouldn't have been buying three houses or four houses be approved to have three or four houses. They created those very conditions. Now, if you go back far enough in time, you find like around the Great Depression, there was a nationwide housing crash around
Yep.
farmland.
Yep.
Their models just didn't have data going back that far. But of course, now the models do have the data of a nationwide crash, so we're not lending with those standards. So I don't really think that you have to worry about a crash due to too low lending standards. And then you go to the only other time it's really occurred is the Great Depression, where you had an economic event so severe that otherwise performing borrowers could never no longer perform. And probably the big risk of ironically, a Great Recession type event was '08 when the financial system was teetering because they basically had recreated the conditions for a housing bubble. So that's all a long way of saying that I think there's certainly worry in some markets,
For sure.
um, but it really doesn't look like we have the worry of kind of a nationwide synchronized crash that we had for the simple reason that we just don't look like we have that number of borrowers that can't service loans or got approved to not service loans. It doesn't mean that Wall Street won't create a disaster somewhere else. But if you take a look, say, at 2000, the dot-com crash, well, after that, it was real estate. So I would probably look elsewhere for for where Wall Street's going to create a disaster. It probably won't be the same place twice, but I'm sure there'll be a Wall Street disaster somewhere.
Well, I mean, you got to add to it that Dodd-Frank was instituted not just for the purposes of I guess of reorganizing banks and how they lend, but it was also created to make sure that banks were sufficiently liquid, had the ability to service or continuing to service their assets, while, or I should say, really their liabilities, even though they are actually technically assets, but will or have the ability to service them and not actually crash the market by having banks fail, and having other banks have to buy them and so on and so forth. Banks also were required to create specific, let's just call it policies related to stress testing and how it impacts their portfolio and their liquidity. I think that's somewhere people don't really necessarily understand the differences and what occurred. This wasn't just a referendum on people being able to state what their income was, even if they didn't make it and prove it. It was about making sure that the banks were more organized and more, I guess, ready and prepared for something that could potentially happen if there was some sort of black swan event.
Yeah, and I would also say that a problem that probably came out of that was the whole too big to fail, and we saw that
Hmm,
emerge in '08, and that has problems for economic growth rates, for productivity, and other problems, but it
sure,
doesn't have problems so much for a nationwide real estate crash. So I think we will find things to worry about, be concerned about, but
sure.
right now a repeat of '08 is just not something that due to the lending standards still being more stringent looks to be in the cards.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the only other side I might add to it as well is that are there areas where prices are inflated? Sure, but that's really kind of I mean, I would say they're inflated prices primarily because of easy or economically speaking, supply demand theory. I mean, you've got too many people moving to an area because the area is nicer and there's not enough housing, so the prices are going to go up. That doesn't mean that they're going to dramatically crash. That's the only side of it, and that's not all the way across America. That's in a lot of specific areas or specific regions.
Yeah, no, good point. I think that's something we will cover in future videos is just because we don't see signs of a nationwide crash or nationwide downside doesn't mean that every market's safe and there aren't issues in other markets as well as markets that could
For
do well.
sure.
But I think we will cover that. But in the comments section, hey, let us know if you think we got it wrong. Let us know what we were missing here. Subscribe if you haven't. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up and visit our website, selectfincap.com. Register for our free newsletter and to get on the list to see exclusive commercial real estate investment opportunities. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Thanks, Steve.